which is maybe understandable in our culture, but if we have Christ in us, the Spirit of the living God in us, that should give us the internal resources and ability to move towards those we disagree with and stay at the table together. And I think one of the quickest signs that our lean has become a bow is when we're just so quick to break fellowship, with people who see the world differently.
I'm Liberty McArtor, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. You may recognize me from the Millennial Roundtable or sometimes the Weekend Edition, and I also host the Know Why podcast, which is a partner ministry with Point of View. But I'm always so thankful for the opportunity to be with you on the Point of View broadcast. We have some important topics and excellent guests that we're going to be speaking with today. I'm very excited to talk to pastor and author Joshua Ryan Butler about his new book, The Party Crasher: How Jesus Disrupts Politics as Usual and Redeems Our Partisan Divide. Joshua, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you so much, Liberty. It's so great to be with you.
So I have the book. I have all kinds of sticky tabs and notes in it. I marked it up. So I definitely encourage people, if you're interested by this conversation today, to get a copy for yourself. But as it's an election year, people are very focused on politics right now. And Point of View is one of many voices that encourages people to research the candidates, to engage politically, to get registered to vote. But I think your book is so important right now, Joshua, because you really speak to what is most important of all, which is making sure that we're doing all of that with Jesus at the center of our allegiance and from a truly biblical worldview.
Yes, definitely. I think it's so important these days. One of the driving questions for me as the book as a pastor and just seeing in our communities has been, how do we stay united around Jesus with families, friendships, churches fracturing all around us? I've just seen so many occasions where, so many people I know feel like going to Thanksgiving dinner is like you're heading into World War III. Like they're just heading into family members with different opinions. And how do we, I think our positions are important, but also our posture. How do we have a posture that allows us to stay at the table with people who are maybe coming from different places and perspectives? And so I share a story in the opening of the book of a church that was in our network where half the church disappeared. Out of 3,000 people, 1,500 members left, and they left angry. This was in the last election season. And why? The lead pastor had posted an Instagram video online, and I thought it was pretty tame, but there was a small handful of 7 people who kind of read it through a particular ideological grid, stuff he wasn't actually saying, but they sought to take down the church on their way out. So they started coffee shop conversations, email chains, spreading misinformation and slander. They started scouring the sermons of all 10 churches in our network, looking for any ammunition, scouring social media feeds of all the leaders and their spouses, looking for anything they could use to take down the church. And it worked eventually. There was 1,500 members out of 3,000 left angry. And this was, it wasn't the church where I was leading, but it was one that we were really close with and was part of our network. And so a lot of our people in our church had friends and family and folks who were there. And it was just heartbreaking to see the impact of division. And I wish I could say that was a one-off event, but I've talked to so many leaders nationally where it feels like this is the new church split, where churches are fracturing along political fault lines. And the major pressure points are not so much doctrinal as they are cultural. And as I mentioned earlier, that we're all feeling it in kind of friendships and families. And so the question of, I think obviously researching candidates, and it's important that we be proactive in how we, and how we approach voting and everything else in the season, but also the question of our posture of how do we come together in a world that's coming apart, where Jesus died for the unity of this church. And so how can we live into that Christ-like posture that desires unity and seeks to, embody kind of the posture that Jesus had for us as his people as we come into this contentious season.
Yeah, so good. And so you've got 9 chapters in your book. And what I really appreciate is that you don't just, criticize what's obviously a problem, which is all of this division and vitriol that has infected our politics, but you help us understand the why behind it, and that there are often times, some legitimate concerns or fears that maybe have become center when they shouldn't, but kind of helping us understand why. And so before we go to our first break, let's rewind to 2016. It's hard to believe that was 8 years ago, but I think a lot of people probably relate to the anecdote you shared, and they've experienced that division. And we all know that it was different. It wasn't just like normal political disagreements, but in 2016, there really was a shift in how this started to divide us. Why do you think it was different then?
Definitely. So the grid that I use, my friend Jim and I, we used this in the last election season trying to explain what the heck has happened. And we call it the four political religions. And I found a lot of folks have found this really helpful. It's just kind of a way of understanding, as you mentioned, 2016 and 2020, kind of the increasing pressure we felt. And here's the big idea is, we tend to think of politics as left versus right, which is true, but we can miss that there's also a top-down spectrum. So if you can, listeners can imagine in their head kind of a left-to-right spectrum and then a top-down axis in the middle, which represents modernity at the top and post-modernity at the bottom. And one of the claims I make at the beginning of the book is that this modernity and post-modernity has split the traditional political divide and helps explain why some of the deepest fighting we see today is not just left versus right, but it's different camps on the left and different camps on the right. And so I describe the four quadrants that this gives rise to as kind of these four political religions that are vying for our allegiance today. And so the modern left, we have the religion of progress. And here's the creed is, we can change the world. There's a strong faith in things like scientific discovery, technological advancement, strong institutions, higher education, research and public policy. This religion is most prominent in places like Silicon Valley. And we can think of like Google and Facebook and the smartphone and the tech boom and artificial intelligence and medical breakthroughs. And so I go into more detail describing how this can function like a religion at times. But if we think of the modern right, this is what I call the religion of responsibility, whose creed is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So here there's a strong faith in personal potential, hard work, good moral values, responsibility, individual liberty. And we can think here this religion is most prominent in the suburbs. And we can think of like Wall Street, classic conservatism, the free market, business entrepreneurship. And when I was growing up, that kind of felt like the grid, right? Like those two seem to be kind of the camps. But to go to the lower quadrant, I think we have to talk about the shift from modernity to post-modernity. And if you're a philosophy major, you're probably going to slap me right now for how simplistic I'm about to be. But I think we can think of modernity as something like a scientist in a lab coat with a microscope. It's sort of a visual stereotype for modernity was all about reason and the values of the Enlightenment, like the scientific method, building strong institutions. And there was this optimism that we could solve the world's problems through those things. But now post-modernity, in the lower half, is a reactionary movement. It saw modernity's failures, things like world wars, nuclear weapons, evil things like eugenics that were done in the name of science and progress. And so a visual stereotype for post-modernity, I think we can think of an artist who's painting a picture of themselves as the artist. There's a strong emphasis here on creative self-expression.
Yeah. Our typical kind of left-right divide that we think of the United States as being divided into has actually been divided further by modern philosophy and then postmodernism. And you were kind of explaining, okay, what are the postmodern quadrants and what are kind of the political religions that are elevated there? So finish telling us about those.
Thanks, Liberty. Yes. Yeah, so we kind of walked through the religion of responsibility and religion of progress in the top, kind of the modern half. So now the bottom half, the postmodern religions, I'd say the postmodern left, I describe as the religion of identity, where here the creed is live your truth. Like, don't let anyone else tell you how to live your life. This religion is most prominent in the urban core. So we can think of places like San Francisco and Boston, race and gender yard signs like I have all around my yard or my neighborhood here, in Northeast Portland. We think of figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Elliot Page, protests against legacy of injustice, TikTok and Instagram posts with an ethos of self-expression. And there's still here a desire for progress like we have in the upper left, only now there's a pessimism about the ideas and institutions of modernity being able to get us there. So the focus is no longer external on those kind of things. Now the focus is internal, like look within yourself to make progress is kind of the message in this religion. So the focus is on discovering and expressing your most authentic desires. And we can think of preachers in this religion being pop icons like Lady Gaga and Lil Nas X, who model the way of salvation for the masses through kind of performative self-expression and continual reinvention. And So if we go from there, move from the postmodern left to the postmodern right, I call this the religion of security. And here the creed is good fences make good neighbors. And there's a sense here that we live in a dangerous world. We need boundaries, borders to keep people safe. Security, it allows us to prosper. Insiders share codes of conduct or rules of behavior for how we live together. We should display thick bonds of loyalty to insiders and be wary of outsiders who could threaten our way of life. And so this religion is most prominent in the heartland left behind by the coastal economic booms. And we can think of things like hometown identity and jobs shipped overseas, Detroit and the decline of manufacturing, figures like Tucker Carlson and Shannon Hannity, Appalachia and the epidemic of meth addiction and unemployment. And here, because it's postmodern, there's kind of a pessimism towards institutions of modernity. And so we'll hear a lot of rhetoric or language about how, the deep state government wants to take away your rights, big pharma med, it's, the medicine is pushing its pills and its vaccines on you. The fake news media is out to deceive you. The elites are out to get you. We need to kind of band together and stand up against those things. And so in sum, we have, the religion of progress, religion of responsibility, of identity, and of security. And the question that I ask, in the book is kind of, well, the big question, which quadrant does Jesus belong in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the claim of the gospel would be that Jesus doesn't belong to these values belong to Jesus. And I want to suggest that each of these values has something good to bring to the table. We actually see in the Garden of Eden, we see progress and responsibility and identity and security. We see those in the biblical story as values that God has. But we also see that there's a danger when we make an idol out of any of those values, when we kind of uproot them out of God's creation and design and make them kind of an ultimate thing that we order our whole world around. Anything that we turn into an idol can become destructive, it can become an idolatrous that distances us from Jesus and his world. It can wreak havoc in our world around us. And so that's where I want to suggest that when we do that, Jesus is the party crasher, that he tears down those dividing walls and those idolatrous barriers that we set up, and that we're feeling the pressure of, as you mentioned, I think in the last few election seasons, we've increasingly felt this pressure of things becoming more divided, more fractured, and people spending billions of dollars to try and pull our allegiance into these different directions. And so a lot of the rest of the book then is going, okay, if that's sort of the lay of the land right now, then how do we stay united and come together in a world that's coming apart?
Yeah. And I think that is so helpful, too, just to think in terms of, those four Americas, as you say, because like you said, those things like progress, responsibility, identity, security, those are not bad. But I think they can also help us see, like, if we are talking to somebody that maybe belongs in one of those other quadrants, instead of just getting frustrated of, how are you not seeing this the way I'm seeing it? Or why are you, so messed up in your theology? Maybe use those guides to realize maybe where their point of fear is or their point of need is, because Jesus is, like you said, the one that fulfills those things perfectly in all of us. And so I think that is just really helpful. And you have a lot of helpful practical tips, and I want to talk about those some more later in the interview for approaching hard conversations. But one thing I mentioned that you mentioned in the book is that you're not saying we shouldn't be involved in politics or that we shouldn't talk about politics. But there is a difference between a political lean and then a bow. And I really liked that distinction. And how can we tell if we are kind of falling into a bow, so to speak, rather than just having our political leaning?
Great. That's so great. Thank you, Liberty. That's a wonderful question. Yeah, I do. One of the claims in the book, or the call in the book, is I believe Jesus calls us to bring your lean, but to submit your bow. And your lean is your perspective. It's often shaped by our experience or a lot of factors, but your bow is where your ultimate allegiance lies. And I think, as we bring our lean, it's helpful to recognize that Jesus called disciples with different political leans. He called blue-collar fishermen and white-collar doctors. He called to himself, zealots who wanted to overthrow the empire and tax collectors who were maintaining the status quo of the empire. And that was intentional on Jesus' part. We can miss how revolutionary that was back in the day, but back then, these groups wanted to kill each other. So I like to think of it, it's almost like Jesus was inviting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ben Shapiro into a small group and going, okay, now you guys have me in common. You got to learn how to work this out.
Yeah.
And it's not like those leanings went away overnight. Like I imagine the disciples after a long day of ministry with Jesus, sitting around the campfire and processing everything that was happening, and they brought those leanings with them. And I don't think Jesus was surprised. It wasn't like he's like, oh my gosh, how did a zealot get in here? Or, oh wow, how did I miss it? A tax collector got in. No, Jesus was intentionally doing that because I believe Jesus's goal, his end game in the gospel, is reconciliation. It's to reconcile to himself a diverse group of people, yet who have him in common and are increasingly being conformed to the image of Christ. Their lives are becoming more and more aligned with his values and his kingdom. That's a process that takes place over time. And so bringing our leaning, in light of that, I think one of the quickest signs that your lean has become a bow is your quickness to break fellowship when someone disagrees with you, and again, we're seeing this right now in our families, in our friendships, in our churches, just the quickness to I just can't be around that person anymore. I can't go back to, a conversation with them because of what they posted on Facebook or their particular political view or this thing that they said. We're really becoming, I think, very quickly and easily offended, which is maybe understandable in our culture, but if we have Christ in us, the Spirit of the living God in us, that should give us the internal resources and ability to move towards those we disagree with and stay at the table together. And I think one of the quickest signs that our lean has become a bow is when we're just so quick to break fellowship, with people who see the world differently. I give an example, of this in the book of, I think when our filter, we need to be able to watch our filter because, I show a story of in the 2020 election season, we had someone against our church and he was really angry. He approached us and was like, why do you guys have these All Lives Matter posters all over your building? And I was thinking, what All Lives Matter posters? We don't have, he's like, you guys have All Lives Matter posters all over your building. He was coming more from the left, kind of postmodern religion of identity. He's like, you guys have these, posters all over your building. And I'm like, what? Did we get graffitied or tagged? What happened? And he takes us to show us, and it's our vision statement for the church for over 10 years has been, all of life is all for Jesus. All of life is all for Jesus. And so we were saying all of life is all for Jesus, but his filter was distorting that. And he was hearing instead something that we weren't saying. He was hearing a political message of all lives matter. So his ideological grid or filter was distorting what he was hearing, and he was hearing through a very uncharitable lens and coming with kind of active and curiosity. And, 2 weeks later, we had someone in the church who the message of the sermon pastor's preach was on progressive sanctification, which is the idea that we don't become sanctified or holy overnight. It's progressive. It takes time. And he made this very clear, what he was talking about in the message. But at the end, there was a woman who was just irate, and she was coming more from the postmodern right, religion and security, going, why are you saying if I'm becoming sanctified, I'll be becoming more progressive? That's not what we were saying.
We've been talking about kind of a new way of understanding the divides, the political divides in our culture, and then how as Christians we can deal with that. And so, Joshua, right before the break, you were giving us some kind of humorous examples, but probably relatable for a lot of people listening on how easy it can be to misunderstand each other or to really just look at things through a political ideology lens rather than a biblical lens, or rather than to see the truth. And so this leads to frustration. This can lead to misunderstanding. And so one of the things that you include in the book is what I think is a very helpful guide for having hard political conversations, especially with believers who maybe hold a difference of opinion than you, or maybe you've been hurt. Maybe they misunderstood something you said and now they're, spreading things about you that aren't true. But how can we facilitate or engage in conversations that can actually work toward repair rather than just staying divided?
That's great. Yeah. So one of the things that we developed last election season that we're using again this one is called a Christian political commitment. And this is actually available as a free download on my website if anyone wants to just access this and have that as a free resource to use. But these were basically 10 commitments that we asked our church to sign on to, just going, hey, would you consider signing on to this as about our posture that we're going to hold in this election season? So these 10 commitments, they were not so much about what positions to hold as rather about the posture with which we were going to hold them, And
Mm-hmm.
we jokingly called them the 10 political commandments, joking because we didn't want them to be confused with the actual 10 commandments that God gives at Mount Sinai. But seriously, in the sense that, like, these are actually things that God commands his people in Scripture. So we have, biblical foundation for all of these that we include in the commitment. But to give an example of a few of these 10 commandments, the first one was worship. When I commit my allegiance to King Jesus over all idols and ideologies. We've been kind of talking about that the first half of this show, right? We've been talking about,
Mm-hmm.
committing our ultimate allegiance to Jesus.
Yeah.
But another one, a little later, was the image of God, saying, I commit to honoring the image of God in all people by treating them with respect and abstaining from dehumanizing caricatures. And I think this speaks to what you brought up earlier, Liberty, like the power that can come when we're seeing, even if we disagree with someone, seeing that there may be something in their leaning, the quadrant that they lean towards, may have some good gifts to bring to the table. And seeing them as someone who we might disagree with, but actually that there may be some good things that we can learn from, and we can approach them with curiosity, seeing them not as just kind of I don't know, in our culture today, I think we're encouraged to see them as an idiot who's destroying the world, and actually
Yeah.
seeing them as, someone created in the image of God with dignity, and I want to kind of learn from their perspective and approach them with curiosity rather than just accusation as an image bearer. Another one, the next one, was biblical wisdom, saying, I commit to having my views challenged by the biblical story rather than using the Bible to prove text my predetermined positions. And we found this was a big one, going like
Yeah.
there is a tendency to, I think one danger that's fracturing us is, when your lean has become a bow, another sign of that can be when you're listening to pundits more than scripture, like
Yeah.
when your vision of the world is being more shaped by whatever pundits you're listening to than the biblical story. And I found that different quadrants tend to have their favorite areas of scripture they like to focus on, So the progress quadrant likes to focus on Genesis 1 and 2, and we're creators of culture, and God's calling us to partner with him in cultivating and stewarding creation and taking it somewhere. But they can tend to be softer at times on exploring the reality of sin and its ramifications in the world.
Yeah.
The responsibility quadrant can really like Paul's epistles and the Proverbs that talk a lot about righteousness and responsibility and what it looks like that we're called to live that in our life, but can focus less on the prophets and kind of them calling out some of the realities of injustice in our world at kind of broader social levels. The identity quadrant really likes the prophets and all, but can shy away from Jesus' command to calling to deny yourself, to pick up your cross and follow him, and to die to yourself that you might truly live, including some of your desires. And the security quadrant can really focus at times on areas like spiritual warfare passages and the apocalyptic, but can minimize some of the other areas of scripture that we've been looking at just now. And so really going, man, we need the whole Bible for a fuller understanding of God's world. And I think there's an invitation here to go, I want to actually not just use kind of selected little anecdotes from scripture to kind of back up my own position, but I want to immerse myself in the biblical story and let that maybe critique some of the narratives that the different quadrants and political religions of our day are trying to narrate a different understanding of the world to me. I want my view of the world to be shaped more by God's story and seek biblical wisdom.
Yeah, that is so convicting, because there is so much information, and here at Point of View, we want to help you digest that information from a biblical perspective, but nothing is going to top reading the Bible for yourself. If you want a biblical worldview, that is just so true. And then you can see when scripture is also being misapplied by others, maybe for political ends. And you include some examples of that in your book as well. And I think we've all seen that happen. But in the few minutes we've got before we go to the next break, I wanted to just kind of touch on how you say that we've lost sight of our role as peacemakers. And I want to talk about this because I think that some people may think, okay, how can I realistically be a peacemaker, maybe with somebody who I really, really disagree with, and I just think that they're wrong? Can I maintain my conscience and commitment to what I think is right and be a peacemaker at the same time?
Great. No, definitely. And, the last 4 of the 10 political commandments really deal with peacekeeping and peacemaking, and there's a whole chapter devoted to that. And one of those is, I commit to face-to-face conflict resolution rather than vitriolic arguments in social media or talking behind someone's back. And I found, oh my goodness, last election season, there were so many conflicts within the church or relationships with people, in our community where it's like, oh man, just a quick phone call would have resolved that,
Mm-hmm.
because there was misunderstanding. But the tendency is the reality I found where, hey, did you hear so-and-so said this? Or, I think this is where, like the assumption of where someone's coming from. And that kind of gossip, slander, whatever, it can just build, and resentment, bitterness builds. And then, I share a example, the whole chapter on this is built on a real story from our church where a whole group developed this big concern because they thought someone one of the teachers in the church had said something extreme in a private class. And then 6 months later, once it came out, like they realized, oh, he never actually said that, never actually
Oh,
meant that,
wow.
never,
Mm-hmm.
and it was just, but it built into this huge thing that was disruptive and whatever. And I've heard so many stories after story after story like that. And I love how Jesus in Matthew 18, he shows us how to deal with conflict. And he says, if you have an issue, like go and talk to the person directly,
Yeah.
and so I think our first step should be, man, even just a quick phone call, 5 minutes. Hey, I kind of heard this. Is that true? And 9 times out of 10, I found the person is just like, oh no, I didn't say that. I actually said this, and this is what I meant. Like, oh, okay, that's great. And it can just prevent so many things from cascading downstream. And so one of the things we did in the last election season at our church was we created a online appointment calendar with 15-minute appointments. And we just invited, hey, if there's something you've heard, something you're confused by, something you just are wondering and want more, clarity on, just create a 15-minute phone call anytime during the day. We have one of our pastors available. We'd love to talk with you and address it. And what we found was that so many misunderstandings were just so easily cleared up with a quick phone call. And honestly, there weren't even that many phone
Mm-hmm.
calls, but our people in our church were often talking about it, going, oh man, I'm so grateful we have this thing, just where I think I found so many people, I think, just want to be heard right now,
Yeah.
and if we can take the time to approach those conversations with curiosity and listen, one of the commitments is humble learning. I commit to being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger as I seek to learn from the varied perspectives of the body of Christ. I think that can go a long way towards diffusing other unnecessary conflict in our families and friendships if we really just approach with a posture of curiosity rather than accusation.
Yeah.
That can really impact.
Absolutely. That is such good advice. And I really think it harkens back to the golden rule too. If you don't want somebody spreading rumors about you based on something that maybe they misheard, you'd want them to come to you directly. And how much conflict could be resolved if we were willing to do the same. Well, we've got one more segment coming up with Joshua Butler on his book, and we're about to go to a break. But don't forget, you can go to pointofview.net. You can find the link to his website that he was referencing where he's got that commitment. If you want to download it for your church, you can also get the link to his book, which if you've had your interest piqued in this conversation so far, maybe you want to get a copy for yourself, you can do that at pointofview.net. And as we wrap up our interview with Joshua Butler on his book, The Party Crasher, I do want to mention that in the book, there are discussion questions at the end of each chapter. So if you've been listening to this interview and you think, wow, maybe this would be a good book to read through with a small group or friends from church or just friends in the neighborhood or maybe my family, it really is a good resource that is very tangible and practical with lots of wisdom that you can apply. And don't forget that you can find the resources that Joshua's talked about at his website, joshuaryanbutler.com, but you can also find a link to that at pointofview.net. So, Joshua, something that I thought was very interesting that you include in your book is the 5 marks of the early church. And those were great, but as you pointed out, they kind of challenge a lot of our political leanings today. Do you mind sharing what some of those are?
Definitely. Yeah, I've been inspired by learning more about the early church over the years. So there's a famous historian, Larry Hurtado, who studied the early church, and he talks about in his book, Destroyer of the Gods, he talks about these 5 marks of the early church that he draws out. One is multi-ethnic community. So this was radical in the ancient world, that you only ate with people kind of your same class, same gender, same social status. But the Christians were breaking all the rules and having these feasts with people that, you would come together and from all different ethnic backgrounds. And that was shocking in the ancient world. It stood out. The second is care for the poor, how they were known, the early Christians were known for caring for not only their own poor, but the poor surrounding them in the empire in a way that this was an age before social safety nets, and the emperors and others were like, oh my gosh, look at the Christians, how they're actually caring for the poor. We need to compete, or, it was inspiring and countercultural. The third was a high bar sexual ethic, so you think the ancient Romans were kind of famous for being, you could say, stingy with their money not stingy with, generous with their sex, so to speak. They're having a lot of, especially men, powerful, lots of sexual partners. Whereas the Christians were famous for the opposite of being generous with their money and kind of quote unquote stingy with their sex, reserving that for the marriage bed and having a very high bar of their sexual ethic because they believed this was designed to point to something much greater, the union with Christ that we're made for. And so it was only for the context of marriage and one man and one woman. So there was a high bar sexual ethic that confronted Roman social norms. And the fourth was they were pro-life with children, meaning they stood against abortion and they called out infanticide. And Christians were famous for going out to the trash heaps and picking up infants who had been discarded, which was common back then, and especially female infants for families who wanted sons. And so they would bring these children into their own family and raise them as their own. So it was like an early foster adoption movement and really powerful witness. The fifth was forgiveness and enemy love, that they forgave those who persecuted them like Jesus had forgiven them. And all these were powerful and countercultural. And what strikes me about today, those kind of 5 values today, is a comment, an observation that the late Pastor Tim Keller made, which was, if you are, if you lean left politically today, you tend to get excited about number 1 and 2, kind of multi-ethnic community, care for the poor, but you tend to start to get suspicious when people start talking about number 3 and 4, like the sexual ethic and pro-life, right? And if you lean right politically, we can tend to get excited when people talk about number 3 and 4, but can tend to get suspicious maybe when people start talking about or emphasizing number 2 in political discourse. But nobody likes number 5, right? Nobody likes forgiveness and love. But the reality is that Christianity was able to hold, or the early church was able to hold all 5 of these together. And I believe that's an example for us as a church today. As you mentioned earlier, the calling of the book is not to become apolitical or try to be as centrist as possible. Sometimes it's holding multiple things at once, And so I believe that those are examples. I'm not saying those are the only areas, but those are 5 examples of areas that I believe as the church we are called to hold together and be bold in and stand counterculturally, that we would hold a high bar sexual ethic, that we would be pro-life for children and the unborn and vulnerable children in our communities, that we would care for the poor and be known for generosity on that front, that we would embody and value the multi-ethnic nature of God's kingdom, which is every nation, tribe, and tongue, and part of a global people around the world with the global church, and that we would be a people of forgiveness and enemy love. And that if we actually press into all 5 of those things at once, I think that's going to make us countercultural as a community in our kind of public witness and our civic, involvement in our society today. That's going to break some of the boxes around us, but it's areas that we can confidently be bold in and press forward in as the church to have a countercultural presence and witness in our society today.
Yeah, so good. So again, this has been an interview on The Party Crasher by Joshua Ryan Butler. It's a great book. You can go to pointofview.net and find links to get it for yourself. And I just am so glad that you've been able to join Point of View today, Joshua. And in the couple minutes before we have to wrap up this hour, I wanted to ask, as you have implemented these things in your own local church and the 10 political commitments and things like that, have you seen a difference or heard from other people kind of that their heart posture has changed as they approach politics maybe with a more healthy and biblical lens?
Yes, so much so. During the 2020 season, one of the things that just came alive, is during and after that season was, and just to say, this came out of our whole leadership team as a church worked on this, and the comments to our leadership team was like, thank you so much. We felt equipped, prepared, able to navigate in, to not bow to kind of the cultural idols, but to have a strong presence and witness and kind of a peace and stability going in. And now as we're going into this year, we've been doing a sermon series at our church and some different events and resources and equipping and all. And again, we're just hearing so many of our people say, thank you so much for not shying away from the tough topics, but giving us kind of a maturity and a stability and a picture of how we can walk faithfully to Christ in this season. And so I think it's a really powerful opportunity that as much as it can be challenging for many of us, I know these days, we can feel the challenge of this election season. I actually think it's a powerful opportunity that many in our culture are hungry for, seeing a different way of navigating and walking through that's not marked by the vitriol and the contentious division around us, but actually models kind of a stable, confident, the peace and the boldness and the witness that Jesus would call us to as our King.
Absolutely. A great resource. The Party Crasher, How Jesus Disrupts Politics as Usual and Redeems Our Partisan Divide. Thank you so much for being with Point of View today, Joshua.
Thank you so much, Liberty. Grateful for the conversation.
Thanks so much for listening to today's Point of View Highlights. I'm Liberty McArtor, host of the Know Why podcast, a weekly podcast for young adults who want to know why they believe what they believe. If you have young adults in your life who would like more meaningful conversations like this, send them over to knowwhypodcast.com. And we'll see you next time on Point of View Highlights.